At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP11. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 23 Ronald September 13, 1946 after school. When Jessica told Ronald during homeroom that she wanted to break up with him, Ronald wasn't surprised or mad at all. To be truthful, relief washed over him. The two of them never had any attraction towards each other, and they rarely acted like a couple. At times Ronald would think Jessica was cute, but it wasn't like they had a deep connection. However, when Jessica explained her reason as to why she wanted to break up with him, that shocked Ronald more. "I like Yuta and I want to confess to him. That's why I want to break up with you," she said. Yuta of all people. It's not that he was jealous of him. For all he cared, they could do whatever they wanted to do with each other. The reason why he was frustrated had little to do with Yuta stealing her ex-girlfriend's heart. It was the fact that anyone, even Jessica, would choose someone else before him. It pained him when he realized that he was not only second place next to Josh but also Yuta, of all people. Ronald sighed and buttoned his varsity jacket to hide his weakened heart. As he approached the library, he noticed Jimmy standing with his arms crossed and his back slumped against the door. "Hey Jimmy, where are the others?" Ronald asked, glancing around the empty corridors. Jimmy huffed, wondering the same thing. "Late," he mumbled, with a scowl plastered on his face. Ronald light-heartedly chuckled at Jimmy's bitterness, never before seeing the dorky boy like this. "Allrecht, Stupormann. We'll simply wait." The others finally arrived, and they were also in grouchy moods. Ronald glimpsed at Jessica and Yuta, wondering how her confession went. Surprisingly, they stood apart from each other, both wearing sullen expressions. Although they weren't the only ones with grim faces. Olivia arrived last, trailing far away from Josh, Jessica, and Barbara. Ronald raised an eyebrow, wondering what happened to all of them. Just yesterday they were all cooperating like a team, even if they were just playing basketball. For a couple of hours, it seemed that they were getting somewhere with not only their paranormal activity investigation but also their friendships. As they walked into the library, Jimmy began giving them orders, but no one was listening. Ronald gazed around the Willesden library, never before stepping foot in this place. He was too busy with football after all. Dust collected everywhere as far as he could see, and spider webs wove loosely around books, dirted shelves and stands. Overhead, busted lamps hung from the cracked ceiling that was embedded with braided wires. The ground was littered with dirt, books, and torn paper, which caused Ronald to wonder why the librarian never cleaned it up. The crevices in the wall allowed small slivers of light to spill inside since the windows were tinted with gray. Dust floated lazily around them, causing them to have a difficult time breathing, and every step put more of it into the air. The faint chirps of birds outside, the scurrying feet of introverted students, and the rustling of papers were all that could be heard. "Do y'all understand?" Jimmy loudly asked, which snapped Ronald out of his trance. The group of teenagers exchanged uncomfortable glances with each other. Neither of them has heard a word Jimmy said. Jimmy noticed and slapped his palm over his forehead, groaning with disappointment. "Search the entire library for anything remotely related to Willesden. Any piece of information will be of use, no matter how insignificant it may seem. I recommend searching through the history and nonfiction sections first," Jimmy repeated, eyeing each one of them. Josh scoffed. "No, I'd rather check the porno section," he sarcastically mocked. Jimmy widened his hazel eyes, clearly disturbed by Josh's vulgar comment. "Wait, does this mean we have to, actually read books?" Olivia asked, raising an eyebrow. Jimmy rolled his eyes and nodded, which Olivia responded to with a disgusted look. "Got it?" Jimmy questioned, and the unenthusiastic group grouchily nodded their heads in response. As the group parted ways to search for some clues, Ronald felt a tap on his shoulder. He spun around and saw that it was Josh. His green eyes were wide with guilt and his tousled auburn hair was swept off his forehead, as if he purposely wanted to look Ronald straight in the eye. Ronald immediately rolled his eyes and stalked towards Yuta. "Wait, Ronald!" Josh exclaimed, but Ronald ignored him. He was not in the mood for Josh's taunting. Yuta, Ronald called, slapping the boy's scrawny back. Yuta jumped up with surprise, and the gray book in his hand almost slipped. Where's Carter? Is he feeling better? He asked, leaning against the dusty beige bookcase. From the corner of his eyes, he could see Josh approaching them, so he swiftly grabbed Yuta's arm and roughly pulled him to the side. Ow. Ronald, why are we walking this way? Yuta questioned, clearly struggling against Ronald's strong grip. His oversized black sweater pulled up with him and then bounced back into place when Ronald let go. Carter is still in the nurse's office, Yuta answered, rubbing his aching arm. Ronald nodded, ignoring the disdainful glance Yuta threw him. He's going to be pissed when he finds out we had an after-school meeting without him, Ronald pointed out as he stuffed his hands in his denim pockets. Anyways, Jessica dumped me, he suddenly said. Yuta's eyebrows arched up as his eyes widened. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, he said. Ronald wasn't sure whether he was genuinely sorry or not. It would depend on whether he and Jessica are dating now. Ronald shrugged, with a nonchalant expression on his face. It's not a big deal. I only started dating her to get closer to Olivia, but I heard they're not friends anymore. Ronald quickly glanced back, and to his surprise, Josh was standing behind him, patiently waiting for him. It caused him to jump a little, as Josh's intense stare reminded Ronald of the ghost he met the other day. Ronald audibly groaned and rolled his eyes before turning back to Yuta, wondering why Josh hasn't got his message yet. Jessica said she wanted to break up with me because she carries a torch for you. So did she confess to you? Yuta bit his lip and nodded timidly. Yeah, he muttered, looking down at his feet. Did you say yes? Ronald asked, realizing he had to further tug at Yuta for a solid answer. No. Yuta honestly replied, giving Ronald an uneasy look. Ronald widened his eyes, not expecting that. What? You know, she dumped me for you. She fancies you quite a lot, Yuta. Even I knew. How could you defrost her like that? There was no guilt in his eyes, which made Ronald feel strangely angry. Everyone seemed to take their first-place honors for granted. Yuta bit his lip, aware of how terrible he sounded. I'm just not interested in her like that, he said, shrugging. Ronald boisterously laughed in disbelief, his arms crossed around his puffed chest. Not interested? In Jessica? Hey, less talking and more reading, Jimmy shouted from across the room, looking directly at Ronald and Yuta. Ronald exchanged a knowing glance with Yuta and they parted ways, not wanting to anger Carter 2.0. Josh swiftly trailed after Ronald as he walked through the aisles. Ronald, listen to me for a second, I need to tell you something. Important, Josh pleaded, but Ronald simply sped past him. I don't want to hear it, he said, grabbing a random book from the shelf and walking faster. Ronald knew Josh was lying when he said he needed to tell him something important. It was typical of cunning men like him trying to manipulate him. Ronald rapidly flipped through the yellowed pages of the book as Josh caught up to him. Please, Josh panted, placing a hand on Ronald's shoulder. Without hesitation, Ronald violently swatted Josh's hands and walked forward, with more spring to his steps. I'm serious, Ronald. Just 1 second. Why would I listen to someone who beat the shit out of me the other day? Ronald snapped, looking ahead as he continued to walk away from Josh. Come on, man, Josh groaned, slumping his shoulders. Ronald halted in his tracks and glanced back for a second. Josh took it as a sign to step forward, although Ronald had underlying intentions. Josh gave him a tiny smile and opened his mouth to speak. Before he could even begin, Ronald shoved Josh and jabbed his ribs with his elbows. Then he walked away. What the hell was that for? It hurt, Josh spat as anger boiled in his green eyes. Ronald scoffed at him. Go cry about it to your mommy. I could care less, he said, throwing Josh a scornful look. Josh's mouth hung open as he halted in his tracks, knowing exactly where he got that from. Ronald grinned and rolled his shoulder, proud of himself. He walked through one of the aisles and began genuinely searching for something because he knew Jimmy would scold him if he didn't at least try. Plus, it seemed plausible that something about Willesden would be in one of the textbooks. As Ronald sifted through the dusty books, Jessica whizzed past him, a pile of books clutched in her hands. Oh, Jess. I heard Yuta shot you down in flame, he said, not intending for it to come out as taunting as it did. Ronald's lips parted as a silent gasp escaped his mouth. I didn't mean. Jessica gave him a dark glare and chucked her heavy books at him, without hesitation. The sound of the hard books slapping against Ronald perked everyone's attention in the silent library. "No need to remind me," Jessica furiously yelled. "Hey, respect the books," Jimmy suddenly shouted from the other side of the bookcase. His head popped out from between the books, which surprised Ronald. Ronald rolled his eyes at Jimmy and walked to a different section. He felt pity for Jessica and regretted talking to her in the first place, but it's not like her life was going to end. He rubbed his reddened arms that took most of the impact from the books and scoured through the next aisle of books. As he searched through the gritty bookcases, someone suddenly slammed a book against the ground. Ronald jumped up with surprise and peered down. "Olivia?" Ronald questioned, crouching as curiosity got the better of him. Olivia was slumped against the bookcase with a frustrated expression, and a pile of books sat in her lap. Olivia turned to look at Ronald, tucking a strand of hair behind her ears. Ronald wasn't sure if the general population would say she was conventionally beautiful, but to him she was. Her large liquid brown eyes held such allure and serenity that he was easily held prisoner by them. Her cheekbones weren't high and her nose was too flat to be perfect, but there was undeniable symmetry to her features, and perhaps that's what captivated Ronald. Her fluid dark hair gently cascaded over her shoulder bones like the flames of the sun, kissing her soft tanned skin. And if she was the sun, Ronald found comfort in knowing that he got to be in her orbit, even if only for a little while. "I hate this. Firstly, people are going to see me as a book beater now. Secondly, is there really going to be any information on the thing in a book?" She rambled, clutching a black book that was torn at the edges. She slammed it against the floor and Ronald chuckled. "Olivia, remember, we're searching for information on the school," Ronald said, plopping down on the dusty ground beside her. "And don't throw the books so carelessly. Mrs. Briggs is watching us," Ronald added, pointing towards Mrs. Briggs. She sat at the librarian desk, scornfully peering through her rectangle-rimmed eyes at the 7 students. Ronald could understand why. Seeing a couple of jocks and popular girls inside a library were quite a rare sight. Olivia sighed, rubbing the temples of her forehead. "Whatever. I honestly don't care about this whole thing anymore. Sometimes it feels like we're getting closer, but then something happens, or even worse, nothing happens. Then we're back to square one," Olivia hopelessly said, drumming her fingers against the black book. Ronald nodded with agreement. "You're right, Olivia," he said, picking up a dusty green book from the stack in front of them. "But we should still at least try. I don't want to go through the rest of my life experiencing the thing. I have dreams, you know." Olivia looked up and nodded, her lips curving up into a tiny smile. "Yeah, me too," she softly whispered. Heat rose to Ronald's cheeks, as it has been a while since he's seen Olivia smile. Although it was timid, it equaled the rays of the sun without a doubt. As they sifted through a couple of pages, briefly scanning the books, a question popped into Ronald's head. "What exactly happened between you and Jessica? If you don't mind talking about it," Ronald asked, looking at Olivia with concerned eyes. Olivia bit her lip and looked up from her book. "We're not friends anymore," Olivia mumbled, sighing. Her brown eyes looked tired and her face was makeup-free, as Ronald noted upon closer inspection. Ronald had never seen Olivia this sad before. She was usually upbeat and talking all the time, but for the past few days that was simply not the case. "Oh," was all Ronald could think of to say. He quickly realized that he probably should say something a little more helpful. "Well, don't get too hung up on it. Friends come and go," Ronald assured, giving Olivia a compassionate smile. Olivia shot him a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" she asked, truly not understanding. Ronald paused for a moment, wanting to word his next sentence correctly. "Well," he started, picking up the black book that was lying between them. "Sometimes childhood friends should remain childhood friends," he continued, flipping the book open to a random page. "We all grow up. Some people are." He gasped when his eyes randomly landed on a paragraph within the grubby book. He scanned the words repeatedly, to make sure what he was reading was truly there. His palms turned sweaty as his heart thumped loudly and adrenaline pumped through his veins. "I found something." "Ronald, you were saying something?" Olivia asked, peering at the book that caught Ronald's attention. Ronald pointed at the paragraph his eyes were on, his fingers shaking with excitement. The ragged book was splayed in his lap, and Ronald handled it carefully, not wanting to wreck it. It took a couple of minutes for Olivia to fully understand and digest the words written on the page, but when she did, she gasped. "Ronald," she exclaimed, looking at him with wide eyes. "We have to show them." He immediately nodded, and together they stood up. They rushed towards the middle of the tiny library, and Ronald placed the book on the round table. "Hey, we found something!" Ronald yelled as a sudden wave of excitement ran through him. The others were scattered around the room, but the library was compact so they could hear Ronald's urgent announcement. Jimmy hastily ran towards the table, tripping over a book, as the others followed behind him. "What? What is it?" Jimmy exclaimed desperately, pulling out a chair. The swift movements of everyone disrupted the peaceful library, and Mrs. Briggs was growing angry by the second. "Quiet," she scolded, screaming louder than the students. "If I hear one more yell from you students, I will send you to the principal's office," she threatened, wagging her bony finger. "Sorry, Mrs. Briggs," Utah said, a guilty expression on his face. From beside Ronald, Olivia rolled her eyes, displaying everyone's exact emotion towards their cruel teacher. As soon as everyone was seated around the wooden table, they bombarded Ronald and Olivia with urgent looks. "Tell us now," Jimmy said in a moderately loud voice. Ronald nodded and opened the book. Before he could place it down on the table for them all to see, the library doors suddenly burst open. The students looked up with confusion and saw that it was Carter who entered. A neck brace was clipped around his neck and crutches were in his hands as he grumpily stared at the group. "What the hell? You guys had a meeting without me," the cloudy-haired boy shouted, limping towards the table. Ronald bit his lip to stop from laughing at Carter's silly appearance, but Mrs. Briggs wasn't so pleased. "Quiet. This is your last warning," she roared, her rectangle glasses glaring at the kids. They exchanged wide-eyed looks and leaned forward to fill Carter in on the details. "Ronald and I found something that could be useful," Olivia explained, pointing to the black book in Ronald's grip. Carter nodded and urged Ronald to show them. He placed the book on the table and flipped open to the page he marked. The book's spine croaked, and he believed that if he pressed too hard it would crumble in his hands, like a decaying flower. The edges of the black cover were frayed, causing the bristles to pinch at his skin. The cover itself was unremarkable, as it was an ominous black color with the title printed in a darker shade. Inside, the creased pages were thinner than air and yellowed with age, as if it had gone through centuries of current. The stories inside were unbeknownst to them, but it seemed as though the words were for one soul since the ink was written so deeply within the pages. It was no ghost nor voice from the beyond, yet it haunted them in other ways. Ronald pointed at the paragraph that caught his eyes and handed it to Barbara, who offered to read it aloud. In the year 1446, the School of Willesden was built. It replaced a church that was previously known for satanic activities to occur. Barbara read aloud from the book. She paused for a second so the group could look up and digest the information. Right away they found intriguing similarities. "There's more. These satanic activities were thought to be produced by witches, as at that time it was popular to consider women who practiced medicine as witches. These early accounts of witchcraft would later result in witch executions, leading up to the Salem witch trials. It is thought that the origin of the first witch trials of the 15th century took place at the church Willesden High School was built upon. There was an explosion in their brains, the good sort, the type that carries more possibilities than one could be conscious of, causing the once grim group to suddenly light up again. The thrill of finally finding answers to some of their questions was exciting, and the giddy teenagers couldn't keep it in any longer. It seems their team strategy truly did work, and Ronald blissfully wondered what more they could do if they simply took leadership. Everyone started talking at once while Carter huffed in disbelief. "The Salem witch trials are a load of crap. It's just old men killing innocent women. Witches aren't even real," he remarked, rolling his eyes. Jimmy nodded. "True. But this information is useful," he pointed out excitedly. "We finally have something of import. Willesden was built on a church. And apparently this church had satanic activities going on. How ironic." He spoke fast as if he wanted to relay as much information as possible. Ronald widened his eyes. "That sounds eerily similar to the paranormal activity we're experiencing. Since we are seeing demons, shadows, and ghosts too. It wasn't difficult to believe the truth of the text because of what they experienced." Ronald knew that if a random student had picked up the book, they would scoff with disbelief. Jessica nodded eagerly. So this confirms the fact that paranormal activity has been occurring at Willesden since the 15th century, or maybe even further back at the church. She paused for a moment, fully digesting her words. Wow, this school is old, she remarked. Yuta let out a quick gasp. The text says the activities were produced by witches. Does this mean a witch could be the one who marked you? Oh my gosh, if it's a witch, then it has to be Mrs. Briggs, Olivia said, nodding towards their teacher who sat at the librarian desk. Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Briggs, who was writing on parchment paper, side-eyeing the group suspiciously. She's like centuries years old, I swear. Carter shook his head. Witches aren't real. He hissed at their stupidity. How can you instantly believe this? Where's the actual evidence that paranormal activity occurred at the church? Josh rolled his eyes. This is the only lead we've got, Casper. And be careful not to move your head too much. Your neck might break, he teased Carter's outlandish appearance. Carter gritted his teeth but decided not to fire back. Their new findings were a lot more interesting than Josh's side remarks. What's the title of that book anyway? Jessica wondered. Jimmy turned to the front cover and read the words that were imprinted on the black book. Pars de Malleus Maleficarum. Huh. I think that's Old Latin, he read aloud, tracing his fingers around the worn-out text. Maybe there's more information somewhere else in the book. Yuta earnestly pointed out. Jimmy nodded and flipped through the pages. Ronald winced at the rough way he handled the book but clenched his jaw shut. By the way, I think we're going to need another book on the history of the witch trials. Perhaps it'll help us understand this better. If paranormal activity is possible, then I'm sure at least one which exists in this world, Jimmy said, twitching his nose as theories flooded his brain. Barbara stood up. I'll search for one, she offered. After long minutes of scouring through the library, with help from Jessica, they finally found something. Ronald could tell by the gleeful shout that escaped the girls. They returned to the table, and Barbara excitedly waved a purple book in the air. Found something. Although I'm not sure if it'll tell us everything, she said, handing the book to Jimmy. Jessica clapped her hands and high-fived Barbara with joy. From beside Ronald, he could sense Olivia stiffen. Okay, let's read it. I want to know about the early witch trials around the 15th century. Perhaps there will be a mention of Willesden or the church, Jimmy said, scanning each crinkled page of the smaller book carefully. He nodded when he found some useful information. Well, here's some history. Throughout the medieval era, mainstream Christian doctrine had denied the existence of witches and witchcraft, condemning it as pagan superstition. However, a couple of years later, new superstitious beliefs regarding witchcraft caused certain Christian theologians to panic. They created a new doctrinal position stating that a person could obtain real supernatural power through a collaboration with the devil. Do you guys actually believe they were witches? Carter asked, scratching his head. His bandaged hands were placed on the table, and his crutches leaned against it beside him. Ronald wondered what exactly happened to Carter yesterday. Fear entered his mind as he thought about how recently the paranormal activity has been becoming harsh. As if the controller desperately wanted to kill them. Of course not. At least not now. But back then, I suppose since the church began believing it, that's what caused all the witch trials, Olivia pointed out. Everyone turned to stare at her like they didn't expect her to be this smart. Come on. It's not that hard to connect the dots, Olivia huffed, placing her hands on her hips. Jimmy nodded. Olivia is right. It says here that, afterwards, hunting for witches became a common practice. The targets were usually women, especially those who practiced medicine because it was thought that they would conjure something to kill their patients. Evidence that would be used against them during these trials would be natural moles on their skin, claiming that they were the devil's mark. These witches would be hung, executed, and tortured. The witch trials lasted through the 15th century to the 18th, and in some parts of the world to this day witch hunting is still sporadically practiced. Jessica parted her lips in surprise at the shocking information. These accusations were false, right? Because of course witches are not real. Ronald nodded with agreement. Yes, but how else would it explain the activities that occurred in that church? From that book, it says that witches were created through a collaboration with the devil. What's stopping a couple of witches to produce paranormal activity at a church? Like Jimmy said, if what we're going through is possible, then so can supernatural powers. Is there anything else in that first book? Yuta asked, pointing to the black book that laid beside Jimmy. He had asked Jimmy before, but they were so caught up with witches that they forgot to thoroughly search the first book. Ronald raised his eyebrows as he couldn't shake off the feeling that perhaps Yuta wanted to redirect the conversation somewhere else. Jimmy flipped back to the black book. Unfortunately, no. It's just a lot of useless information about how the school was built and its founders, he said, shrugging. Although it wasn't extremely disheartening, since what they found today made up for 1.5 weeks of unclarity. Yuta furrowed his eyebrows deep in thought. Who are the founders? He asked curiously. These are some pretty wild medieval names, so prepare yourself, Jimmy said, tracing his fingers around the words. Sir Petur Iohannes VI, Sir Aymeriget Tuyen, Count Terowan Rodolphus, Cardinal Witched 9, and... Oh my, Jimmy suddenly gasped, his eyes wide and his mouth hanging open. What? They all asked at once, eager for information. The group leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse at what caused Jimmy's jaw to drop. Sir William Stevenson too, Jimmy muttered, looking up at the group. He turned the book around and showed them the text. Everyone gasped with surprise and grabbed the book. Huh. Ronald knitted his brows as they all recognized the name. Mr. Stevenson's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is one of the founders of Willesden. What a coincidence that he teaches here, he pointed out. That's so cool. Josh said, laughing as he pointed at the scratchy drawing beside his name. The drawing wasn't detailed, and it looked as if a toddler had drawn it. Josh passed the book to the next person, with a grin spread across his face. We should tell him. They all let out a chuckle in agreement, as the tensions in their muscles slowly decreased. Even on paper, Mr. Stevenson had a way to make them laugh. When it was Ronald's turn to grab the book, he examined the pages deeply, searching for any other useful information. It would be terrible if they missed something important. To Ronald, the best piece of information they had gotten so far was the fact that Willesden was built on a church. Perhaps there would be more somewhere deep in the midst of these crackled pages. He flipped to the back of the book, hoping there was something of interest there. Ronald suddenly gasped with surprise at what he saw. This surprise wasn't the excited one he had before with the text. It was a surprise full of shock and fear. His hands suddenly began trembling and shifted his gaze towards the group. So what do y'all make of this information? In my opinion, it solidifies the fact that someone is controlling the thing. It just so happens to be at this school because of the church. Perhaps a witch is among us, disguised, Jimmy theorized, giving Yuta a suspicious eye. Yuta noticed and groaned. That's just crazy. I'm not a witch. Witches are women, and I'm clearly a man, he scoffed defensively. Are you sure? You never know these days, Josh sardonically commented, peering down at Yuta's black pants to emphasize his joke. Yuta shoved Josh playfully but didn't forget to shoot him a disgusted look. Folks. Ronald choked, his eyes wide as beads of sweat rolled down his face. He gripped the black book tightly, wanting to let go for fear of it being cursed, but he forced himself to continue clutching it. Who knows what would happen if it went into the wrong hands? Carter sighed and placed his bandaged arms on his hips. I wonder why the witches would want to make the paranormal activity happen at the church, he wondered out loud. I mean, it's not that far-fetched if they have a vendetta against Christians since they were believed to have retrieved their powers from the devil. So you believe it? That this is all a couple of witches doing? Olivia confirmed with the group. You do realize it's never explicitly said that this is paranormal activity. We're just jumping to conclusions. Hey! Ronald snapped, his chest heaving. Everyone turned to look at him, wondering why he was yelling. I found something else. In this book, he whispered, clutching the Pars de Malleus Maleficarum against his chest and facing it away from their peering eyes. Well, what is it? Yuta queried, gazing up at the quivering boy. Ronald bit his lip and slowly turned the book so they could see it. Please tell me that this is just my imagination. There was a moment of stillness with their expressions as they scanned the image. Then their eyes shot open and they all gasped in unison. No. It's not your imagination, Josh whispered. Ronald tensed against the shaking of his limbs at that comment. He attempted to suppress the stillness for a few moments, but he knew he couldn't. Despite that, he needed to drink in the silence to counteract the fear that threatened to engulf him and his friends. What they had seen in the book would inevitably scar the kids for life. if they even lived past this. On the very last page of Pars de Malleus Maleficarum, dark ink was embedded in the yellowed page. The ink formed 3 lines that connected to form the shape of a familiar triangle. A harsh line shot through the middle, with dots of ink splattered around it. Below the triangle, numbers were scrawled in shaky handwriting that formed an unfamiliar date. 9/3/1246.